Well, thank you, David. As I say, there certainly are interesting times that we're living in here, and unfortunately, for those of you who have come looking for a feel-good story or a positive spin, I'm afraid I'm going to probably disappoint you because there's a lot of moving parts right now, and unfortunately, at least in the case of the U.S., most of those parts are moving in the wrong direction for our industry. I'm going to start off kind of big picture here. Let me get rid of this. I'm going to start off kind of big picture here and take a look at historically what production is. If we look at our average production over about the last 50, 60 years or so, we see it coming right around here, right around 8,000, or I'm sorry, 8 billion board feet. It peaked in 1999. That was our high water mark for production for the U.S. hardwood industry, for the hardwood lumber industry. And when we talk about 99, you'll see in a slide in a minute how much of the industry and how much the hardwood world in the U.S. Has changed since that time. I'm going to focus a little bit now on just this end here of the, say, the last 4 or 5 years when we start looking at production. Uh-oh, I'm not, there we go. You can see the last, coming back, production came back relatively strongly after the all of the disruption that was caused in 2007, 2008 by the Great Recession. We started coming back, driven largely by export demand for grade lumber. We've seen that now over the last couple of years for various reasons that I'll get into in a minute begin to fall off. But we're now looking at, for hardwood production in the United States, we are at historically low levels. And even though we've seen in September a little bit of an uptick and a little bit of hope, I think, on the horizon, we are still looking unquestionably at historically low levels of production in the U.S. industry. And to look at that, where the wood goes, and I'm looking here at both industrial timber as well as grade timbers in the U.S. And obviously, number one has always been the pallet market. The pallet market has been on kind of a slow decline. We're seeing sort of the same things in the pallet markets that we've seen in the grade lumber markets. And that's quite simply we're losing ground to either softwood or things like plastic pallets and non-wood substitutes are eating a bigger and bigger piece of that. You'll notice out of these main uses, the second one is exports, and that's really the only one that's kind of grown. But if we look at the overall, what's coming off the sawmill production in the United States, in the last 20 years or so, we've seen a huge change. And if we go back, really all the way back to almost World War II, we'd seen the bulk of consumption of the U.S. hardwood industry has been in the grade lumber markets. That really began to change during the Great Recession, 2007, 2008, and it's not really recovered. And if we look now for the last 10 years or so, we have seen the grade lumber markets, the production of grade lumber significantly below production of industrial timbers. And obviously the forest hasn't changed in any meaningful way in that time. It's really the way that the sawmills are forced to cut and sell the timber that goes through them. So that obviously has implications for profitability for sawmills when you're selling a smaller and smaller portion of your production as grade lumber. I'm going to focus primarily on the grade lumber, of course, because we deal in exports, and really that's all we export is grade lumber. And if you look back, I showed you that 1999 being the high point in consumption. The world has changed completely for this industry since then. If we look at 1999, we were consuming about 85% of all grade lumber that was manufactured in the United States was being consumed in the United States. As recently as 1999, and this was the high water mark. Since then, it's fallen off dramatically, and to see why, we've got to sort of look at those major end users in the United States for the grade lumber. First of all, our furniture industry. No surprise, that's kind of moved. That's moved offshore by and large. Mexico for a time, China. It was for a while there in Japan. If we remember, a lot of us in the late 1980s, early 1990s, it was the cheap labor from Japan that was going to drive us all out of business. But it's moved across the world. It's gone into China, it's gone into Vietnam. We could be looking at others later. But essentially the furniture industry as a major consuming market in the United States domestically has really dropped off a cliff. The cabinet market held out a little bit longer because of the needs to do more custom sizes, and it wasn't quite as cookie cutter as it able to do on furniture. But eventually they figured that out, sort of the IKEAization of our kitchen cabinet industry, where we're seeing more of those now being done in standard sizes and being sold much more as a commodity and much less as a custom fixture in a lot of homes. So again, our consumption in the cabinet industry domestically has fallen off a cliff. Similar story in the molding and millwork industry. And this is all very interesting because if you look historically and you look at price levels for US hardwood lumber, historically, you've been able to track that almost directly with housing starts in the US. When housing starts are higher, we see lumber markets higher and we see lumber prices higher. When housing markets slow down, we see production slow down and we see lumber prices decline. Really, since 2007, 2008, after this big drop, after the Great Recession, particularly the housing recession, that's really been decoupled. If you look now at price movements in hardwood lumber from the United States, it no longer correlates to the U.S. housing industry. The U.S. housing industry, unfortunately, our industry has lost a big chunks of a lot of these end user markets. We've got a lot of non-wood substitutes going in flooring, even molding and millwork, doors, and elsewhere. So that sort of direct correlation and using the U.S. housing market as an indicator of prices, I think, was really blown out of the water after the Great Recession in 2008, 2009. Very similar in the flooring industry. We did see a bit of a resurgence in the early 2010s. But again, that's beginning to fall off. So when you take all of those together, our domestic consumption of hardwoods has declined precipitously since the high water mark, certainly of 1999, but really since the Great Recession of 2007, 2008 was really the divide where really everything in our world began to change. The one increase that we've had, again, we see the drop off here from the Great Recession. And then we begin to see a huge increase over the next 15, 16 years on, I guess about 10, 12 years on our exports. And that took a bigger and bigger and bigger chunk of the production. For now, we'll talk about where this drop off came in a little bit later, but it's no coincidence that middle of 2018, when the trade war with China began, we saw the drop off. And along those lines, I wanted to, if you look at this, you see now that shape will be very familiar to you again in a minute. But if we look, the change you saw that night, this graph from 1999, where 85% approximately was consumed in the domestic market, and barely 15-16% was sold overseas. By the time the trade war with China began mid-year 2018, that had really changed. Where essentially now, and again, this is grade lumber consumption, we were consuming about half of it in the US, the other half was going overseas, and half of that was going to China. And this really is where we started to run into problems once we began the trade war with China. Because if you look at it, essentially in 2016, 2017, 2018, essentially 1 out of every 4 grade lumber boards coming off a sawmill in the United States was ending up in China. As a result of that growth over there, the U.S. is and remains the largest exporter of saw and hardwood lumber, even with the declines over the last several years. You'll notice the next couple, we've got the EU in third after Thailand, but of course Thailand is largely rubber wood, so it's in a lot of ways it's not really direct for many applications. It's not really a direct competition for some of the timbers coming out of the U.S. or out of Europe for that matter. If we flip that over and we take a look at the world's largest importers, and again, this is not US exports, this is all exports from all producers around the world. China, again, obviously is by far the biggest, even with this big drop. And again, this big drop, a lot of it is dropped from the United States, but the Chinese market over the last couple of years has been getting smaller, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But when you look at the importance of this as consumers of hardwood lumber, even with everything that's going on, China remains integral to, I would don't know if I want to say their survival, but certainly to the health of the US hardwood industry in particular. So this is exports from all sources. If we look at US exports going through 2019, the last few years, again, China remains the biggest. Canada and Mexico together are second, followed by Vietnam and then the European Union. But again, look at this drop off into China. And part of the issue I think that our industry is dealing with, if you look at it, China, Canada, Mexico, Vietnam, Europe, and then things drop off very, very quickly. So an awful lot of our eggs are in 2 or 3 baskets only, and I think that's been a shortcoming that I think has really been exposed over the last couple of years, given the trade tensions we've had with China and what that's done with our industry. I will show this again because I do want to focus on what the trade to China has looked like. Show this one again, but look at this, the shape of, this is overall US exports, from about 2008 at the depth of the Great Recession until 2018. And this decade, if you notice this shape, will look very familiar if we look at our exports to China over that same time period. So I mean, it kind of gives you an idea of how much China's really sort of dominated the game as far as the US hardwood exports. But I think what was interesting that I think is, I know I talked about this last year in Berlin, but going around the industry and talking, I think it's still not really well understood what exactly the Chinese market has been. There's still a belief that it's all about bringing in raw materials and shipping out finished goods, and it's all re-export market. That was true here, say from 1999 until really the Great Recession. In the Great Recession, when all of that Chinese production capacity was looking at their markets in the US, their markets in Europe, to a lesser extent, their markets in places like Japan and Australia, really begin to drop off the map because of the Great Recession. The Chinese industry looked around and, where can we sell all of this productive capacity we have? Where can we sell furniture? And of course, it dawned on them that, wait a minute, we have a lot of people here in China that are becoming richer and richer and richer every year. So when we look at the post-Great Recession surge in US exports to China, almost all of this is represented by actual consumption of the end product in China. This was Chinese, this is, furniture, flooring, millwork, molding going into Chinese homes, going into Chinese offices, going into Chinese hotels, being consumed in China. That's why the Chinese market was so important to us and remains so important to us. It's not simply chasing the low, the low wage manufacturing centers. It's where the consumption was taking place. And if we look at this again, this is before the trade tensions with China. But if we go back to 2000, we estimated about 85% of all the hardwood lumber that we sent into China was manufactured into a product and sent out of China to other countries, including the US. Only about 15% of that was consumed within China. We believe that by 2016, 2017, that's really been flipped on its head. And the vast majority of what we shipped into China was being consumed in China as a finished good in China. And I can't overestimate how important that was to the US industry. Again, it's not just chasing the manufacturing and moving it from one place to another. This was new, real consumption of hardwood products. And that's been a huge part of the boom that we saw for about 10 years there following the Great Recession. What we showed before, even as recently as 2018, our exports to China were actually more than our exports to the rest of the world combined. You saw that in the earlier chart I've showed. But now if we're looking at the first 3 quarters exports, 2018, 2019, 2020, again, we've seen this big drop off in China, a smaller drop off to the rest of the world, but now we're back to the situation where the rest of the world is actually now together anyways, a larger part of our export pie than China is. And that's been one of the major changes in the last 3 to 4 years. So if we look at what's been going to China and why we're running into issues, the red oak one, this really plays, and I know that a lot of you in Europe that have been going to AHEC events over the years are probably getting tired of talking about red oak and red oak and red oak. But at the end of the day, it's 1 out of every 3 trees in the US hardwood forest is red oak. The Chinese consumed an awful lot of it. When they're not consuming, when the Chinese begin to consume less of it, we need to find outlets. And I think it's really important that people understand, and it's part of our messaging to architects and designers and elsewhere, that, you know, if we're going to sustainably use a resource, we need to create a demand for what nature provides. And what nature provides is an awful lot of American red oak. So again, you'll see a lot of the AHEC stuff. You'll see the importance that we put on red oak, because with the drop off in red oak sales to China, it's causing severe issues with a lot of the sawmills in the U.S. It's really the one species that, whether you're northern, southern, Appalachian, it really doesn't matter where you are in the U.S., you're sawing red oak. And to kind of put this into perspective, just what we've lost in exports to China in the last 2 years, between 2017 and the end of the year 2019, the amount that we've lost on a volume basis, you know, 335 million board feet we lost going into China. So just the loss into the Chinese market was more than our total sales into Vietnam and the EU, the next two largest markets. So I mean, that really kind of puts it into perspective. I mean, our total sales to the next two largest markets are less than what we have lost going into China. And I think that's, you know, again, when you start to see some of the difficulties going on, that explains a lot about it. We did start 2020 off with some good news in February, before we realized what the extent of this coronavirus was going to be. The tariffs in China, the 25% tariffs for most species that the Chinese put on U.S. hardwoods in retaliation for the U.S. trade war, were removed. So we actually began 2020 with high hopes that we'd see a recovery, you know, into China and elsewhere. Of course, COVID threw a monkey wrench into that. In fact, I think a lot of people were surprised, because when this was announced in February, that China was reducing the tariffs on hardwood lumber and hardwood logs as well from the U.S. It kind of came as a surprise, because everything else on that list was related to fighting COVID in China. It was medical machinery, PPE. So they reduced tariffs on everything they needed to fight the coronavirus in China, which of course in February was raging there. Yet somehow hardwood lumber seemed to be included in that package. And I think a lot of that was, you know, through the work that, you know, on this side politically, the U.S. had done, the U.S. industry had done with our trade representatives, and making sure our industry was heard. And when China and the U.S. signed the phase one trade agreement, it was interesting to note that out of the very few specific commodities and specific products that were mentioned as part of China's buying commitment, hardwood lumber was specified and was shown, you know, directly. Very few other products were shown specifically the way hardwood lumber was. But it's important to keep in mind that when the Chinese took these tariffs off in February, they were very clear about they were going to remove them for the course of 1 year to see how the phase one trade agreement between the U.S. and China played out. So China keeps, you know, for themselves the potential to put those tariffs back on in February, again, if the U.S.-China trade agreements don't show some real some real changes. And I think, I can't say I'm optimistic. I think what we are looking at from China, the agreement that we made with China, which was essentially China agreed to buy specific amounts of specific products over the next 2 years, and they made commitments to do that. You can argue about whether that makes sense. I mean, I think the whole thing that we're trying to do is get China to play by a more market-based economy, yet we're telling them their government's going to determine how much they're going to buy from the United States, which I think there's definitely a disconnect there. But if we look at what China's obligations were, what they committed to purchasing, and then compared to what they have purchased, they're coming nowhere close to meeting their obligations. So the question remains now, and I know having a lame duck president on his way out the door, anyone's guess is as good as anyone else's, but I think it's pretty clear that China did not live up to its agreements in the phase one deal, is not even close to living up to its agreement. So what is that going to mean? Are we going to see a renewal of the trade war with China? Are we going to see tariffs put back on at the end of February? I'm an optimist, but I'm saying it's probably 50-50 at best right now, because things are certainly not progressing the way I think that either side anticipated them. So that's definitely something sitting out there that could have profound impacts on the US industry moving forward. And part of that, we're seeing a slowdown in China, which I'll talk about in the beginning, that's sort of independent from the US. So yes, the US, we did between 2017 and 2019, we lost a lot of our market into China, but the Chinese market at the same time, their import market for hardwoods also shrank. So we went from having a 30% market share at the end of 2017 to having a 21% market share of a smaller market again, by 2019. And this really, when we look at where production numbers are, this goes a long way towards explaining that. Yet, the good news, China, out of the world's 10 largest economies, China is the only one that appears to be on track to post a GDP growth for 2020. Nowhere near what they're used to, but nevertheless, it is growing. And I think it's important that when we start looking at things and we look at big picture, there's a lot of talk about the Chinese market being saturated and American hardwoods are everywhere in China. That may be true along the coast, but there are an awful lot of interior cities in China that are being connected through these big infrastructure projects to, high-speed rail, cities like Chongqing, cities like Chengdu, that are doing an awful lot of infrastructure, a lot of buildings being built. There's a lot of upside still for domestic Chinese consumption if we can get a piece of it. That's the whole question: is what role is our U.S. hardwoods going to play in that? But there's no question China's at a crossroads. The days of the 8, 9, 10% GDP growth year on year are gone, and those are not coming back to China. And we look at some of the things that are happening that are accelerating that. And I think you have to look at what Xi Jinping is doing to not only consolidate political power, but he has a very he's very, very clearly trying to consolidate economic power as well. And we're seeing essentially the credit system run by the Chinese government, the Chinese state-owned banks, are really beginning to starve private enterprises in China of capital. And this capital is being given almost exclusively now to these large state-owned conglomerates. They tend not to be the most efficient players. And when you start matching your credit to your least efficient players, that's not good for growth. And I saw a recent article in the Peterson Institute that they're a group of economists that guess that just this in itself, this doubling down on the public enterprises by Xi Jinping is probably costing China between a point and a half a year in GDP growth just through the inefficiencies. So I think that bears watching, because for us, for our industry, a big chunk, probably the vast majority of what we've been selling into China that's been consumed there have been to private companies. These flooring manufacturers, these furniture manufacturers, a lot of these property developers have been private companies. So when these private companies now find themselves without access to capital, that's not going to be good for us. At the same time, China's kind of running out of the potential to keep spending itself, keep stimulating its economy through these huge, particularly infrastructure, but huge government spending. They're beginning to run out. Not only are they starting to run bigger and bigger deficits, almost 200% of GDP now in China, but it gets to a point where particularly infrastructure, where the more and more you build, there's only so many miles of high-speed rail, there's only so many bridges before your returns begin to diminish. And I think China is getting pretty close to that right now, where some of the old tools in their belt on how to respond to a slowdown, I think they're going to find them becoming less and less effective moving forward. Also, and I know I mentioned this last year, but it really is probably the biggest thing confronting China right now, is we call it the demographic time bomb. And essentially what I mean by that, and if you want to see the results, just take a look at Japan in the last 15 years. But essentially you have right now, relative to the population in China, you have very small percentage of the population in China is over age 65, because so many of them were killed and starved to death during the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution and the mass starvations and the famine. So you have a pretty small percentage of the population over age 65. You also have a very small percentage of the population under age 35 because of the one-child policy. So what ends up happening right now, you have the bulk of the Chinese population right now between age 35 and 65. And that works great when they're all in the working age right now. But as that big bubble begins to move towards retirement, you have many fewer people below them. again, look at what's happening in Japan and the stagnation essentially in Japan over the last 10 years, which is largely a result of this same thing. But put that on steroids, and China could be looking at some very, very significant issues coming up in about probably less than 10 years time before this is really going to come to a head. Also for our industry, there's been changes in the housing markets that have not boded well for us. And essentially in that, what I mean is, Chinese couldn't purchase their own houses until about 15, 16 years ago. Once they did, they were very eager to outfit them. Wood is seen as, as a luxury material. The Chinese, particularly the the new middle class, they do like to show off their wealth. And the way that the housing markets worked in China, both in individual housing, but also in multifamily housing, was the developers essentially deliver a concrete shell. Then the homeowner comes in and does not only his wiring and his flooring and his cabinets and his interior doors and everything else. That's all done post-sale by the owner. That obviously left a lot of room for the owners, particularly, again, we had this growing middle class, to choose solid wood flooring, to choose solid wood cabinetry and so forth. And that really was one of the main things that drove our growth into China. You had the Chinese government now that have been making threats about putting caps. They're worried about a housing bubble. They've been making threats about putting caps on home prices, on increases in home prices. It's made the developers very nervous. And what they're trying to do is preempt that by now delivering turnkey homes, but they're worried about keeping the price low. So they're delivering turnkey homes, but they're going about it in the cheapest way possible. So they're putting in, vinyl flooring, they're putting in, particle board doors. They're really, it's kind of a race to the bottom when it comes to interior fit outs. And that's going to have, again, significant impacts on our exports to China, because it was, as I mentioned before, keep mentioning, that domestic demand in China that was driving our growth. I'll take just quickly, if we look outside of China, and obviously we'll talk about Europe in a minute, but if we look outside of China, really the next two individual markets, and this doesn't include Canada, is Vietnam and Mexico. Vietnam and Mexico are very interesting because they have quite a bit in common. If we look through 2019, we've seen lots of growth in Vietnam. Some of this in these last 2 years have been the Vietnamese stepping in on some of the furniture re-exports with the US and China locked in a tariff war. Vietnamese have picked up some of the slack on there. We've seen huge increases in exports from Vietnam, particularly over the last 3 years in finished wood goods, furniture primarily in the hardwood side. We're looking now at the first 3 quarters of 2020. And again, Vietnam is remaining relatively strong when we consider what's been going on in the global economy with the pandemic. A 4% loss is not a huge deal, or 5% loss into Vietnam, I think is better than what many people anticipated. Canada is interesting. We don't really look at Canada, and my apologies to our Canadian friends. And I don't want to say Canada is the 51st state, but as far as how it operates in the hardwood industry, they're very integrated, the U.S. and the Canadian industries, and essentially we have a lot of the same situation that we have in Canada that we have in the U.S. domestically. A lot of this drop, and again, I don't want to start a debate, but one thing that we did see, particularly in red oak over the last couple of years, when the U.S. and China were sitting with the tariffs up on U.S. hardwoods, we saw a huge increase in U.S. red oak sales to Canada, and then we saw huge increases in Canadian red oak sales to China. Now, I'm not saying people were trying to circumvent the trade, the tariffs, but I think those correlations, I think, are interesting to say the least. Mexico, again, we're seeing Mexico's been struggling with the coronavirus. There was a lot of uncertainties with the U.S.-Mexico free trade agreement that's finally been resettled. So I think we're looking at Mexico moving forward. I'll talk about in a minute. There is, I think, some great potential there, but it's going to be a slow uphill slog. And when I say Mexico and Vietnam have a lot in common, it's that both of them have really emerged. When you look at value added to exports, so essentially intermediate as well as finished goods, Mexico and Vietnam have been two of the fastest growing markets in the world over the last 2 decades. they're taking a bigger and bigger piece of the merchandise export markets. And that bodes well, I think, for us. We start looking in the US, things like furniture, why they have it tied in here with toys. We look at US imports from China over the last 2 years, has actually declined by more than 10%. But we look at our imports from Vietnam, they're up by about 8%. And from Mexico, they're also up by only about 4 or 5%. But we are seeing a switch in who's supplying that imported furniture into the US from China to Vietnam and to a lesser extent Mexico. And I think Mexico is poised to take even a bigger part of that. Lots of reasons for it. One of them, of course, which is an obvious one, you start looking at average wages now, and this is along the coastal China. You look at Chinese average wages over the last 5 years, they're significantly higher than Mexico and very much higher than Vietnam. So that goes a long way towards explaining it. But again, we've seen these movements before, and where Vietnam, they're beginning to move up. Wages are getting more and more. So are we going to see Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar taking some of the labor-intensive manufacturing from Vietnam moving forward? I think it's a certainty that at least one or two of those will eventually develop and take some of that away from Vietnam. When we talk about Southeast Asia, at least for U.S. hardwood exports, Vietnam is the only game in town. It's a huge market. It's a growing market, but again, it can't take up the kind of volumes that we've lost into China. And Vietnam, I think, is where China was 10, 15 years ago, or 20 years ago, where most of what we send to Vietnam, the vast majority of it is remanufactured and re-exported out of Vietnam. Even when we start to see domestic consumption in Vietnam creep up, there's about 7 or 8 cities in China that are bigger than the whole country of Vietnam when it comes to population. They'll really never be in a position to consume, and consume the way that China has. And again, this is why the Chinese market had been so important to our industry moving forward. Don't want to get into much into species, but in Southeast Asia, it's been, the tulip wood, the yellow poplar has been a big one. They use that for a lot of I don't want to say lower end furniture, but it goes into things like, framing for upholstered furniture and so forth. The white oak, still remains, obviously that's a big one. Red oak has been not quite as important, but interesting. We're seeing red oak begin to grow and grow again in Southeast Asia. Hopefully that'll continue. I know at least in the last couple of years, a lot of that has been price driven. But nevertheless, any increase that we can find because of the decreases to China, any increase in red oak markets that we can find anywhere is good. What the future holds, if we look at all of Chinese imports, and this is a little bit misleading because this includes softwoods as well as hardwoods, logs, as well as lumber and things. The US, we're only about 13% of Vietnam's raw material imports or wood imports. But if we look at the temperate imports into Vietnam, the US does have a huge share of that. And if we look at things like the vintlas and some of the issues that China's been having with illegal timber, I think we're going to see more and more of a switch towards temperate hardwoods into Vietnam, particularly in their re-export industries, which are really driving most of the demand for wood imports. So I think with the new vintlas in Vietnam, I think there is going to be some potential, not only for the US, but I think for European suppliers as well into Vietnam, assuming that our markets remain open. And this is where now when you think things can't possibly get any worse, after opening up a trade war, the Trump administration with our largest export market, China, we have now opened an investigation, and it looks like we're about to start a trade war with our second largest market, Vietnam. And that, again, that could be absolutely devastating for a large part of our industry. Right now, the U.S. Trade Representative is investigating not only the illegally harvested timber, but also currency manipulation out of Vietnam. And I find the timing, particularly when they talk about one of the reasons the U.S. is launching this investigation is because of what they say is Vietnam's use of illegally harvested timber and putting that into the marketplace. I find the timing of this to be rather surprising when you consider that Vietnam right now is in the process of implementing their timber legality assurance system. It seems to me that if that's something that we want to address, maybe we give them a chance to show whether their mitigation system will work or not work before using blunt instruments like tariff to try to change the Vietnamese behavior. So this one again is going to sit out there. It's going to be, if this does, and again with the new change of administration, we don't really know what that means. But if we look at the potential of tariffs going back on in China after February, and at the same time we see something into Vietnam, it could be a very, very bumpy 2021 for U.S. lumber producers and U.S. exporters in particular. Mexico, we'll talk about. We finally have a new free trade agreement. From our perspective, it really didn't do a whole lot. There's really very little changes as far as the industries that are impacted by us or on timber supplies, except for the fact that now it took away some of the unclarity. Some of the unknowns have been taken out, and now people have a better idea of what the relationship's going to look like. And I think we are going to see real opportunities for Mexico to take on some of that manufacturing, not only from China, but from Vietnam. We already have anecdotal evidence of Chinese and particularly Taiwanese furniture manufacturers, as well as timber distributors, setting up operations in Mexico to target the US market. So I think we're going to see a change. We're going to begin to see, I think, more and more in Mexico. But of course, a 40% depreciation in the peso to the dollar over the last 15 months really hasn't helped our exports into Mexico either. Mexico, again, why it's so important to us, and going back to comparing Mexico and Vietnam, when you look at Mexico's exports and Mexico's re-exports, they tend to get most of their intermediate supplies come from the United States. So increases in Mexico's exports, increases in Mexican production is likely to lead to a much higher sales from the United States of the raw materials, including hardwood lumber, than say Vietnam, which tends to get a bulk of its intermediate inputs from other Asian countries, China in particular. Going too much into details, the hickory, we figured out that this big bump in hickory into Mexico has actually been driven by the automobile industry. It's the Nissan that's making hickory, and I don't even know how to explain it, boxes for pickup trucks that lying along the side that allow you to mount storage boxes and things like that. So we're seeing a lot of hickory going into Mexico for one specific application. Mexico has been overall it does take in a pretty good mix of species, but again, the red oak being one of the higher ones, but again, nowhere near the volumes that we lost to Mexico. I'm going to end up here with Europe a little bit. We've seen a few changes over the years. Probably the biggest one has been the emergence of the UK as the largest market in Europe. It wasn't that long ago that Spain was actually, if you take lumber and veneer together, Spain was actually the biggest market after Canada on a global basis for the US in the mid 1990s. So we've seen, the EU, the UK grow. That's been a very, very good market for us. It's been a very pleasant surprise. Relatively stable in others. This is through 2019. You can see Germany a drop off from 18 to 19, Italy a drop off from 18 to 19, Spain a drop off from, really from 17 to 19. Start looking at now the first 3 quarters of this year, and the biggest drop that we're seeing right now is to the UK, and I'm sure there's a lot of you that have a better idea of what's driving that. Clearly the uncertainty around the whole Brexit is not helping. Slight drop-offs in Germany. Spain, a bit of good news. We're seeing an increase, particularly in white oak, again going into Spain. So that's certainly welcome news for a lot of the U.S. industry. But other than that, you've got to go down to really Sweden before, and lower levels before you start finding any types of increases so far in 2020 into Europe. One interesting thing into Europe, we are seeing a drop off in white oak has been by far the biggest our biggest export. We are seeing, even with all the difficulties this year with the with COVID and so forth, we're actually seeing an increase in red oak through the first 3 quarters of 2020 compared to the same period last year. And again, for us, that's a reassuring. It's a movement in the right direction at the very least. And I hear a lot that, well, that's just because in the last year and a half, red oak prices have been so low. But actually, we've been seeing this increase going all the way back to 2014, 15. We've been seeing a steady increase in red oak sales to Europe. So it's not simply a result of the last 18 months and what's happened with red oak prices. It's been a steady increase that we've been seeing for several years. And again, this is so far through this year, we're seeing, despite the drops to the UK, we're actually seeing an increase in red oak, seeing an increase in red oak to Spain, we're seeing an increase in red oak to Italy, seeing an increase in red oak to Ireland, we're seeing an increase in red oak to Sweden. So despite decreases across the board, again, I know I'm kind of grasping at straws for a good news story out of this, but this is certainly one, at the very least, a movement in the right direction. Just wanted to very quickly, some other markets. Japan, remains the next biggest. Not a lot of movement, but Japan still remains on a unit value our strongest market. In other words, dividing volume by value. The Japanese will buy the highest grades. They will pay for color sorts. They do like things like walnut. So Japan remains an important market. And again, the Japanese, you do have the Japanese designers and Japanese industry to a large extent are specifying what's going into factories, particularly in northern China, but also in North Vietnam. There's a lot of Japanese investment in and around Hanoi in the furniture industry there, whereas in Saigon and in the south, the furniture industry there tends to be dominated more by Taiwanese owned as far as foreign ownership or foreign investment. Australia is one of the few good news ones. We're seeing, again, a little bit of an increase this year into Australia, despite the difficulties. But if you notice, almost all of the increase to Australia has been red oak. Almost no change, a little bit of change in white oak, but almost all of the increase is accounted for by increasing red oak into China. Into Australia. Middle East, basket case. I mean, we're at the worst of both worlds right now. You've got really two different types of markets in the Middle East. You've got the oil economies in Saudi Arabia and so forth. And with oil prices being as depressed as they are, that's limited investment and limited, sales in Saudi Arabia. You have countries like, Dubai and so forth, and Turkey that not just industry, but also tourism played huge roles in. And when oil prices go down, you get less Saudis and less Kuwaitis traveling to Dubai, for example. So it's it's kind of feeding off each other, and the Middle East has been a problem, and I don't see that really stabilizing anytime before the end of the year. Dubai, the UAE in particular, we've seen huge drop the first 3 quarters of this year compared to the first 3 quarters before. And the last one I'm going to talk about, India, which we can't seem to get our feet in the door. We saw a huge 2018 to 2019. We thought we're finally moving for the first time in the right direction with exports to Italy again. To India again. We're talking less than 4,000 cubic meters, so it's not not huge volumes, but at least we were moving in the right direction. And then this year with the COVID, we've seen the absolute collapse of exports into India. But I like to end with, I think there's a potential for India that we just quite simply can't ignore. I mean, it's not an insignificant market. It's actually the 6th largest market globally if you look at their imports from all sources. Yet the U.S. has never really been able to get a foothold in here. And I like to show this one because the timber exporting powerhouse of the United Kingdom, you'll notice here, significantly ahead of the United States in India. But interestingly, that's one species, it's willow, and it's going into one application, and that's cricket bats. So when you look at, that the UK is actually selling more willow to make cricket bats than the world's largest producer and exporter of hardwood lumber is selling all species into India, at least it stands to reason that there's an upside in that market for the US. And these will come in. I won't go through these, but I ended with kind of giving you the biggest gains over the first 3 quarters of this year compared to last year. Hickory to Mexico, we talked about, tulip wood to Vietnam. These will be made available to you. I don't really need to go into them now. The biggest losers, again, Canada, red oak. We talked about that an awful lot of we believe that an awful lot of the red oak that went into Canada in 2018, 2019 did end up in China. But the fact that red oak into both Canada and China are on a downward trajectory, I guess I defeated my purpose of trying to end on a high note. But in the words of Donald Trump, it is what it is. And I will end with that.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. That was fantastic. I'm very pleased to see that you'd brought up the exports of willow to India. I mean, it's really keeping our economy afloat at the moment, and long may it continue. There were a couple of questions have been brought up, both on the idea of species, and there were a couple of comments you made there about the fact that we need to use the species we have a lot of, and how do we encourage specifiers to go for them. I'm going to bring them up right at the end after we've heard from Maria as well, and we'll bring those questions up to the fore. I just wanted to ask you just on one point that you made when you talking about hardwood sales being decoupled from the housing market during the financial crash. Mm-hmm. Why did that happen? I mean, was that just the sort of commodification of house building and things, or were there other reasons?
Oh, I think the main reason is that the hardwood industry, by and large, how to put this delicately, has essentially taken the U.S. housing market for granted. And we just assumed that floors were going to be wood floors. We assumed that cabinets were going to be wood cabinets, and other materials are essentially eating our lunch. So even though housing starts right now are very, very high historically in the United States, the housing market is quite strong, but that's not being translated into higher hardwood sales, because we're seeing some of the luxury vinyl tile floorings and things like that are taking a bigger piece. And I know the U.S. industry, this is front and center for them, and they're kind of scrambling right now to try to put together some kind of a coherent domestic marketing push. Okay. Because as things are right now, I mean, what we've seen, the few they've done some some interest groups where they've talked to consumers and things, and it seems to be, for most people, if it looks like wood, that's close enough. Yeah. We like the look. If it looks like wood, then that's good enough. Sure. We're not seeing a lot of resonation. Things even like environmental messaging doesn't seem to be resonating all that well right now here. So I think there's a lot of work to be done domestically on the promotion side to kind of stop the bleeding.